Hello and welcome to week 4 of oral communication. Today we're going to be looking at audience analysis and non-verbal communication, so things around body language. I'm actually interested in doing this class for you today, not only for this course but also for beyond, because I think it's one of those things that's actually quite fundamental if you think about it. Any presentation you give, any work that you submit, you're always thinking about how it's going to be received, who your audience is and what their expectations are. So we're going to unpack that today and look at how it may be relevant for your particular assignments as they're coming up. I want to give a plug also to a resource that's in this week. I've mentioned it already, but Bernadine Innes-Medford, who is teaching on this course, is a theatre arts instructor, and she has produced something that I think is really useful, and there's an accompanying Q&A with her and myself expanding on some of the ideas about preparing and also presenting when you're doing a presentation, and it's particular kinds of presentation. I think by now it's clear that we can start to talk about certain kinds of presentation, and within the kind of presentation, different ways in which you could prepare because you're trying to do something particular. I also want to say that I'm using a couple of sources for this particular lecture, because I think they give us a really good understanding of the material and of the area. However, I disagree with some of the underlying assumptions that are in these particular resources. And I think it's important that you, if you do engage with the material, that you bear in mind these particular caveats. So of course, audience analysis is, as it says, a way of considering and working out certain aspects of the audience that you're presenting to. So defined formally, it is a process of information gathering to understand the needs of your target, the target's values, attitudes, beliefs and opinions, with a view to creating meaningful content. And of course, there are different ways of considering an audience in order to make some assumptions about what the values and attitudes, beliefs and opinions might be. So we're going to tease those out. Of course, for this course, we're not going to be doing any formal audience analysis. So we're not actually going to sit down and do that kind of research, but we will be using this as a concept because it provides a useful analytical framework, I think. Essentially, you're asking yourself, what audience parameters should I think about when sussing out my audience? What are the specific benchmarks? To start this project of making meaningful content, which is what we're always seeking to do, we should state that even in a group that appears uniform, as you will already know, of course there is considerable diversity. So groups that appear homogeneous actually contain a lot of distinct differences among the individuals, including things to do with comprehension and how information is understood, but of course different attitudes and different beliefs. So in a classroom, for example, some people are going to take to one assignment more readily than others will, because they are just more comfortable with what they're doing and hearing and working with. So one of the things that I think is important is you can present to your strengths when you're a speaker. But what if no one in the audience is interested in your topic? Well, I think you're working towards thinking about story content, delivery, your expertise, how you might grab someone's attention, the angle you take with your story, all of those things are the ways in which you can try to get someone interested. And I believe even if your content isn't of particular focus for everyone in the audience, I think there are ways in which you can actually deliver material to be quite compelling, to be quite convincing, and therefore make a good effort, take a good stab at drawing in an audience member and maybe shifting their perspective. So the second part of the lecture is going to be dedicated to body language and some of the elements of non-verbal communication that I think are useful for you to consider when actually presenting. And we're going to spend some more time in tutorial looking at different aspects of body language. Of course, there are formal descriptors and technical terms for these particular types of nonverbal communication, and I think you may have come across those terms already. We can touch on those, but for this particular course, my interest is in how you're using them and the impact that they might have when you're actually doing a presentation in which you are, of course, visible to your audience, and we have a few of those coming up. To start this process of audience analysis, I'd like to put ourselves in the position of the audience and use these examples from 2 print ads that we will most likely have seen at some point. I think the one on the left was also a billboard ad, but I know that the one on the right also is fairly recent, I think, and has been in print publications. So putting ourselves in the position of the audience, of course the advertisers who created these ads for the clients, Angostura and Cricks, would have had to think about who they're appealing to when they place those adverts in the particular places, as I say, billboard and print. And I've asked the general question of these 2 ads: do they amuse you? Amuse might not be what the advertisers were going for. I don't know exactly, but I suspect they were going at least for something that lingers and leaves you with a positive impact, at least. That's going to typically be the approach of an advert. So let's have a look at these 2 ads. And the one on the left, Angostura, as you can see, it shows the bottle, it shows a woman in a short skirt, it shows a small image on the far left of a Scotsman in a kilt, which is a traditional form of attire. And then the slogan is, in Scotland, men dance in skirts. In Trinidad, men dance with women in skirts. And then on the right, we have the net, cricks and chill, which is a play on Netflix and chill. And we'll come to that one in a moment. All right, so there's so much to provoke discussion, I think. And what I would like to start with is what the advertisers were actually going for. What do we think they were going for? So I'd like to start by raising the issue of the intended audience. Sorry, I'm just thinking about some of my reactions when I first saw the billboard advert on the left. I think I had the same reaction that actually came out in newspaper articles and then ultimately resulted in some particular change, I think, to the way that ad was being used. So let's start by saying that advertisers, when they're thinking about the audiences, are obviously thinking about different kinds of people in an audience, and have to try and do something quite complicated, which is to target multiple groups with one ad, or if they have funding from the client, then to differentiate different target markets and think about where those adverts go in order to really hone in on the particular audience type. They'll typically be fairly well funded, and they'll have had some thought. There will have been, one presumes, a back and forth with the client, some, deep discussions about what we're going to, as advertiser and client, what we're going to put out there, because it represents the company and it represents the brand. So ads will generally need to be attractive, increase brand awareness, because that translates into sales. And we can, just deal with this component of being amused or attracted or not. And as I said, I used amused because I felt that the one on the left was intending to be a joke. So, do you find it funny? I myself found it slightly offensive, but I try not to get overly triggered by things, because sometimes I think it's intentional by advertisers. Other times I think, what's the value in me getting agitated by it? Is it going to affect anything? But certainly we should look at it in terms of its, advertising value and its cultural value. So rather than whether or not we're personally offended by it, who is it aimed at, would you suppose? I would say the advert is aimed at men. I suppose macho man, maybe that's what you would title him as. An older kind of man who's a drinker. Certainly the ad on the left doesn't feel very youthful to me. It has something that feels a little bit staid. And we can talk about this more in tutorial, but it did cause some offence. And, sometimes media manufactures the offence that's taken in a way by going to another party. In this case, I think it went to some Scottish community in Trinidad and Tobago, or maybe elsewhere, and got a reaction from them. And of course, the reference to the folk attire as a skirt, and, seeming to make some cultural aspersion as to masculinity, I suppose. It came out in the article as offence. But again, that's slightly separate and apart from, I think, what we can talk about in terms of the ad and us as audience members. Because maybe the offence was actually intended in some way. As strange as that sounds, sometimes I think advertisers, and maybe there are some of you in this class who have worked in advertising or do work in advertising and can give us your insight onto whether sometimes an ad might be designed in a way that's also provocative, in a way to make it stay and generate kind of other media content. All right, moving on to the Netflix and chill. Obviously a play on Netflix and chill. The innuendo of desire for sexual contact. It's probably for a person who one presumes would get that phrase. Again, I have a fairly lukewarm response to it. It feels a bit budget, to put it politely. And what's the falling drink about? I don't know if I guess it's Coca-Cola. But I guess that kind of splash is meant to be slightly sexualized. We can all think about our own perspectives on whether that works or not, and what its deeper meaning is, if even a deeper meaning was thought about. I think sometimes there's an unconscious depth to thinking about these things, meaning that the graphic designer would have thought about it, maybe told to, briefed to do something, and maybe there's an allusion to something. So basically, what I'm saying is we could look at adverts the way we might think about a speech or a presentation, and say the way we actually deliver it is not neutral. And in fact, the way we intend it is not neutral. in the sense that what we present is not going to work for everybody. And in some cases, it might work for nobody, which of course is not a good look. And we're going to work at mitigating that. So the things that you would want to think about as a presenter and as a speaker when you are asked to speak at an event or create a presentation for something, and I'm talking about outside of this course in part, are these things. The demographics. So what is the societal location of the audience members? What is their age, their gender, socioeconomic class, issues of race, for example. So those are markers of a societal group. And I guess we could say that in a given moment, by external observation, they are generally fixed. There can be question marks about that, of course, but an individual, in terms of their own self-definition, is likely to be able to pinpoint a boundary within which they fit. And so that would be a demographic marker. Psychographic, the issues of values and attitudes and beliefs, I think, are much more in flux. They can be stable too, but we can certainly say they are situation specific. So people will have different attitudes according to where they're to what they're thinking about, different beliefs, and they may even express different beliefs according to the context of the audience around them. But certainly we can say that in a given moment they're not maybe overtly obvious to us as an external observer. They may be, but they may not be. And of course they're going to be contextualized much more than a demographic marker. Something that's situational is dependent on the context of the presentation or speech itself. So what is the physical location which you're presenting? What is the audience size? Why are they there? Those kinds of things. And as I say, for this particular course, obviously some of those things are fixed. I mean, we're talking about assignments, and therefore, your audience is somewhat captive. They don't have a choice in it. The audience might be any of the teachers or class members, for example, because we are going to do a couple of real-time presentations. So we're doing the recorded ones, the first 3 assignments, and the last 2 are real-time presentations. So those things are going to come into play, and we're going to talk about those in more detail throughout the lecture. Now, one of those things that's going to affect values and attitudes, beliefs and opinions, one of those situations that's going to affect those things, is going to be an individual's past experience. And past experiences are essentially situations that are going to shape someone's point of view. And we can talk about them creating this frame of reference in the general use of the word frame. Just to kind of make a distinction, in linguistics, we sometimes talk about a frame as being a script. So when you have an idea mentioned in a particular text, for example, there is a whole arc that goes with it. So you talk about a particular traumatic car accident you're involved in. Just the mere mention of that accident creates in the listener's mind, and therefore and later influences their language perhaps, but it's constructing a whole story, a whole narrative, if you like, that goes with it. Literature uses frames as well, and so we have to be careful when we're using these words in the teaching context, because we're trying to say something in particular. So Here we're talking about a frame of reference in the general sense of a story that someone brings to an experience. What does she or he already know about a topic? And therefore, what is their level of expertise? What is their point of view based on the fact that they already have some insight into this? And I think that's a really useful point to consider when, for example, we talk about commentary articles, in newspaper, and or delivering opinion pieces that are audio opinion pieces. We need to think about the audience and the degree to which they already have some kind of technical knowledge or insight into a topic. It's quite possible, of course, for you or I to pick up a newspaper article on an event that we haven't been following, and actually to find ourselves not really, sure of what's going on, because there are so many kind of intertextual references that we're not familiar with. So, cited sources and pieces of information that are known to an audience member who's been following it. And then what you have to do in order to understand the article that you're reading is kind of go back a few steps and find some previous articles to build an understanding. So that's actually quite problematic when you're in an audience and someone is talking about something of which you're not familiar. It creates a bit of a problem for you as a speaker, because you're not really reaching that individual. They're going to have to, spend quite a bit of time going back and thinking about this. And of course, using jargon is one of the ways to alienate audience members. It's one of the ways that you can be technical, and it's useful if you're speaking to a knowledgeable audience because you're defining something quite particular. But for an audience that's uninitiated, it is alienating, and that can happen in so many different ways in which jargon is used. So anyway, we need to think about the frame of reference. And secondly, we need to think about audience diversity, because we want to be careful to avoid stereotypes and presuppositions. I'm saying that with the presumption that we don't want to be offensive to people. Now, there are kinds of presentation where the speaker is a provocateur and is intending to trigger people or incite them or rouse them and rally them, and to someone who's not a comfortable member of that audience, they might find themselves feeling quite out of place and alienated. So we can think about our audience in terms of what we are seeking to do with them and for them, in terms of this impact and meaningful content. If we're intending to provoke discussion, if it's a polemic and therefore an argument from one particular side, but it's not an audience that's likely to be receptive, then we may be trying to get them to see a point of view and do that in a way that is agitating, but we can also do it in a way that's generates a discussion. So a couple of things to think about. Ultimately, I would say you don't want to belittle someone's point of view by revealing a narrowness of experience, and therefore you don't want to fall into stereotyping by accident. Certainly that's, I think for this course, we want to be mindful of those things. Now, I've already mentioned the 3 types of analysis, but I'm putting them again here because we're now going to start unpacking each of them. And also, I wanted to use this metaphor to talk about the degree to which we need to focus on each particular type of analysis when we come to present to an audience. I'm using the metaphor of a painting being a good way of thinking about how we go about combining these kinds of analysis, opposed to, say, nested dolls or boxes, like the Matryoshka dolls, the Russian nested dolls, where you think about unpacking an audience, and at the middle is maybe their beliefs, and outside of that their demographics, and outside of that the situation. I don't think that is really so useful. And I don't think it's useful because audiences are complex, and we have overlapping ways in which our age, for example, might affect our belief system, or the situation, or race and gender can have impacts in different ways in different people. It's not that there's a one fix solution for going about doing this kind of analysis for a particular speech. I think there are variable ways, and as I say, the focus on how much time you spend and how much of an influence demographic has, for example, or how much a belief system has on how you present to an audience, is going to really depend very much on you, on the context of the presentation, and the kind of impact you want to have on that audience. But let's face it, point of view is something that you might be able to grapple with by thinking about the context of why you're actually presenting to an audience. So for the purposes of this course, obviously, as I say, the audience is often captive, and we are all people involved in this oral communication course. When you're actually going to speak to an audience, say you deliver a eulogy at a funeral, you know something of that audience, presumably. Maybe they're family members, maybe they're associates in some ways, and you know the context of it. So there's a lot of what we're talking about, hopefully, that is taken care of because of that context. But the reason we're talking about it today is because you can't assume too much, and then we're thinking about the kinds of presentation where it's useful to differentiate and analyse what you're dealing with. So we have this metaphor of the painting where things blend and overlap, and the degree to which you focus on each of those things, demographic, psychographic, situational, is dependent on multiple factors. So there's something else to say about categories being overlapping, but then here's the problem. So even though we can say 16-year-old students are going to see the world differently, say, from an older person who's had, personal life experience or challenges, that may not be so, but let's say for a sizable portion it is. What can you then do to approach a group of 16-year-olds whom you haven't met if you're seeking to make an impact on them? Well, you need to be quite circumspect about what you're going to be talking to them about, what you're going to be presenting, and you will need to do some kind of introspection, some kind of analysis of that audience, and it may not be, it probably won't be based on an opportunity of speaking to some of them beforehand to find out what they're interested in. You may have to talk to groups around them, teachers, community leaders, in order to find the kinds of things that they're grappling with if you wanted to give a certain kind of presentation that speaks to needs. In terms of affiliation, of course, we can also talk about group membership and how that's, different and overlapping when you actually go out into the wider world and speak to people. In the past I've taught medical students, and of course, I can think of them as a group of students interested in a particular topic, but they will have very different interests in the topic and different experiences of why it's relevant to them, as indeed you do when you hear this material. Some of you are communication studies students, others are students of other subjects, you're members of different faculties, and therefore the communication definitions and materials may not be as familiar to someone who isn't, a comms major or minor, but isn't a comms student, and therefore, is doing this for other interests and for other reasons. So, we need to be mindful of that. I am mindful of that. When we talk about the psychographic analysis, we can actually think about an audience that has a degree of prior knowledge and how that might impact beliefs and opinions. And as I said, when giving a commentary, you may be giving it to an audience that's actually well informed, and you may not. So the literature that I'm referring to in taking some of the details for this lecture talks about an audience that's cognitively complex or sophisticated, and I'm not particularly keen on that phrasing. I prefer the term better informed. So when you think about your audience, your strategy is going to be different for an audience that's well informed or educated on a topic than an audience that's less well informed. So when we talk about this notion of the cognitively complex audience, we have to acknowledge what it is that they're looking for from this material. So an uninformed audience, a less well-educated audience about the topic, may actually be looking for you to persuade them that what they're hearing sits within a complex mix. However, that may also be confusing. So they may just want a black and white message. And I say may because, of course, all of these things are quite variable. I'll pin it down to an example just now. I myself listen to motivational speeches. I actually quite like to hear things on YouTube by certain presenters that are, what I would say is inspiring to do certain things, push through boundaries, achieve certain tasks, overcome certain obstacles. However, there are times when I'll listen to that and it's quite black and white. It's like the Nike slogan, just do it. And, that doesn't work for me because I'm too far away from the particular inspiration to get over it. It's not the right moment or it's not the right speaker. And in that case, it's actually quite jarring. And I find myself quite irritated with the kind of just do it, because I think, what about the context of not having support? What about the context of not having the right skill level, or whatever it might be? So we can, think about the ways in which we present, and there's quite a lot of, variation. Just to give you a couple of personal experiences of mine, a couple of ones where I've had to, in real time, in giving a presentation, actually realise I'm not reaching the audience and I needed to address it. I once went to QRC, speak to a group of 16-year-old boys, based on the material that I'd written in a book, and the book was on transformational language, and I was trying to inspire them to think about the power of words and how they self-define themselves. And, I got a lot of blank looks, and I realised that I wasn't hitting home. And of course, on the fly, I had to come up with something better. The metaphors weren't working. The material I had, which was, a series of bullet points and ideas, it just wasn't reaching them. So I, broke from the script and actually started talking to them in a different way. You'd think you'd learn by your mistakes, but I did it a second time when I actually was at Narlis at an exhibition, and it was based on the same work, and I was giving a talk to a group of school kids who had come in off the street. Actually, no, I lie. Sorry, it was a school group that I'd organised to be there, and I started talking about affirmations, the power of positive words, and affirming, constantly reciting a statement in order to kind of cement it in your mind. And the school teacher smiled behind the audience and shook her head. And I realised I needed to find a different word. This obviously wasn't reaching them. So, we can think about these things from our own experiences, and hopefully you can learn from my wrong experiences, I suppose, my bad experiences. But I would like to say I've also had, successes. I've spoken to students in England about the power of reading. I was a reader for my local county council at some point when I was 18, and I'd written a short story, and I went to a school group with someone from the BBC, and we spoke about the power of storytelling. I've also spoken at YTC on notions of freedom, and I think that worked quite well. I was with a group of people. I wasn't by myself there, and I've followed up with them. And I've done work with medical doctors and medical students who have reported remembering important lessons that were being taught in that moment, and I was able to give some good examples and use material that stuck with them. So all of this is to say audiences are complex, overlapping. Think about how well informed they are, and think about the degree to which you need to use these three types of analysis to help you become better informed to the audience you're trying to reach. So as I was talking on that previous slide, at about the 6th minute I should have moved on to this one, because this is where I wanted to reference the idea of a complex audience, or as I say better, well-informed audience or an informed audience, because here I wanted to talk about the notions of an audience that's already informed, and also you using that to think about the audience's point of view. I think that if you're speaking to an audience that's well informed, they actually might want something narrower on a particular topic because they want insight on a new topic, a new point of view, or you're bringing information to them in your particular way. If you speak to an audience that's less well informed, you might want kind of an introductory type lecture, something quite broader. And actually, when you're speaking to a broad audience, sometimes the complexity of there's this, this is possible, that is possible, but neither really works, and you'll have to find your own way. That can actually be quite difficult for a new audience to hear. They're not ready for it. They may need the more general overview where you actually give quite pointed directions and talk about things in a more, I don't want to say dogmatic, but in a more, what's the way I want to say it, in a more direct way, in which you limit the possibilities, because at that point a new audience needs to be introduced to a topic, and an introduction is unlikely to be the kind of very complicated discussion where all the variables are kind of laid out. So just think about the different ways in which an informed audience and a less well informed audience are going to need to hear your information, and the kinds of things you can do to bring them up to speed on a topic if you're giving a presentation that is perhaps informational. So in thinking about our audience, we can also try and get some uh, data from the situation itself. How big is that audience? Where are we doing it? What is the occasion, and how voluntary are they? So I've put this image up of some what looks like jail bars, could be burglar proofing, I suppose. And we're not sure who is the captive audience member here, um, but somebody is trapped. And essentially, how should we treat an audience like that? Well, definitely with respect, and trying to keep them interested, trying to be compelling, I think is important. Nobody wants to give a presentation that doesn't reach anybody. But actually, I do have an example which I'm going to put in the material on my learning. It's from a TED talk that I listened to, and I really like TED talks. They're super informative, and they have a lot of um, good speakers doing them, and speakers who have spent some time crafting the story. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of skill to get it there. And this particular one I want to leave with you is one that actually doesn't work, and it has humour. It has an informed speaker, and for some reason the jokes just don't land. And I just think it's a really useful example that even with the best kind of practice and the best kind of education on a topic, we may still not get there for some reason. And I just think it's worth looking at what not to do, or how it can not work as an example. But anyway, with respect to the situation, the audience size matters. I think the biggest audience I've spoken to face to face is 400 or so. That was quite nerve-wracking, I have to say. And I did, have to think about what is going to be the level of comprehension of this material in such a big group. In some ways, the bigger the group, the easier it is to do something that maybe is skewed towards the more informed, or those audience members who are going to more readily comprehend something, and the less kind of hand-holding you have to do, I think, according to what the topic is. The setting makes a difference to people's comfort level, of course. The occasion, as I've said, indicates much of how you approach a topic, and voluntariness. If you're in a class, I'm really making the effort to keep you engaged by giving you good visuals, hopefully giving you some stories that will hit home, and giving you the kinds of material that you'll find useful, because we're thinking about this course and we're thinking about beyond. I just want to spend a brief moment talking about rapport, because it's one of those things that's mentioned on the rubric, or is often on rubrics where delivery is concerned, and it's thrown about in ways that don't always have an immediate link to what we're seeking to do. So rapport really is this idea of harmony, and one wants harmony with an audience because you want to make some kind of connection. And I think it actually is more than a logical connection, it's more than an issue of cognition, but it's an emotional connection. And so we're seeking to carry someone's emotions along, and that's actually a slightly more difficult task than simply presenting information that you want someone to hear and hopefully understand. So when we're looking at rapport, we understand each other, we empathize, and we communicate well in order to achieve those things. And I've put up this image on something that I've come to understand about the distinction between empathy and sympathy. It is my feeling that sympathy is on the left of this illustration, if you like, where the receiver is highly emotional and doesn't have the kind of, I've put logic at the other end, but doesn't have the detachment, the cognitive detachment from the situation, and therefore gets caught up in someone's emotions. Empathy is further to the right of that scale, where I've put the knife, I suppose, where you have an emotional connection, and there are different types of empathy, but we don't need to get into that. You have an emotional connection, but there is a degree to which there's some analysis, some logical interpretation of what is going on, and therefore you're not swept along with someone's emotions. Now, I have to say that in the course of working on this course, as I have over the years, I once heard a student who did an occasion speech, which is one of the assignments for this course. She did an occasion speech, and she actually did a eulogy for a friend, for a funeral that she didn't have the chance to speak at. I can't remember the exact circumstances of why, but I definitely remember her speaking, and I remember her reaction because it was very emotional. And she was emotional, and it made the audience members emotional because what she was saying was just so real, so authentic. It was a real eulogy that she would have wanted to give had she been able to. And it was, a very kind of sad and moving situation. And I, I just wanted to recount that story to say that rapport is not necessarily something you have to work hard to achieve if you are actually speaking from a place of connection and in a genuine way. So it's not that it has to be manufactured, I'm saying. It's something that can happen. And so we can all find ways in which we can build rapport. It doesn't have to be that we leave everyone in tears or laughing hysterically, but we might want to think about ways in which we can generate an emotional connection. And again, having an audience, as we will for a couple of the assignments, is really important because it gives us a way of speaking to people, and even if we can't monitor the reactions, knowing that they're a live audience and they're responding is enough to add another dimension to the way we actually think about presenting. Well, here's a bizarre image on a slide, probably the most peculiar that we're going to get for this lecture series. I'll try not to repeat it. But I put it up because it illustrates a couple of the non-verbal comms categories that I'm interested in us considering when thinking about presenting. Vocalics refers to pitch, how high or low you speak, and also the volume at which you speak and the speed, and hence the mouth. And oculesics is about eye contact and the degree to which you hold someone's gaze when you're speaking and you're looking at an audience member. And there are kind of ways in which those things can be positive and negative. They can be perceived positively and negatively in terms of communication. Just to talk about vocalics for a moment, the definition also includes something that in teaching communication we separate out when we teach it, and that is the issue of paralanguage. Paralanguage are the things that might be okay, those kinds of things, and that can indicate a lack of assurance or a certain kind of confusion, but it can also be one of those things that's used by someone who's a little bit hedgy, and a verbal hedge is an act of hesitation. So just to say, when you look up vocalics, if you choose to, it's tone and pitch which are the most important for us. And you want to think about that because modulating your voice has an impact, and it can be important in order to help build rapport. Oculesics we can talk about in terms of the eye contact. When you're looking at an audience member, in a positive way you could make eye contact. It can become a little bit negative if they feel you're staring at them and you're holding their gaze for too long. And also, you can also feel quite dismissed if you find that you want to make eye contact with a speaker, or you want them to see you for some reason, and they are just kind of looking over you and really not making that eye contact. So that's those two categories, which I think are really important. I actually watched a particular TED talk, and there was a psychologist who was speaking, and she actually had what I would say is an affected voice. It was seemingly artificial, and her presentation was overly polished in a way, and it felt like a spiel, like a sales pitch, and I didn't particularly like it. So that's another example of TED Talks which don't work. And as I said, it highlights the fact that with all the best intentions, sometimes we just don't reach every audience member. I mean, we can't necessarily seek to, but we want to try and reach people. And this is also to say sometimes the overly polished presentation might not be the best way to reach your audience because it can almost feel a little bit too slick. Have you ever heard a sales pitch where someone's been talking and it's so obviously rehearsed and so obviously something that they've said, 50,000 times, to the point where you just hear the patter and it doesn't resonate. So that's something to do with the kind of cadence, and I think we should be mindful of that. So a third non-verbal comms category that I think is really important is one of chronemics, and chronemics deals with time and facets of time in different ways. So how long are you speaking for? How fast are you speaking? And how are you developing a scene? Is it an outline? Is it a description? Or is it a narration? In which case you're actually going to go into more depth. So I actually want to read for you a quick example of what I mean by narrative depth, and you can see how that impacts time. This is from a creative non-fiction piece that I wrote called Balding as Seen from Space, and it's a personal account of uh, why I came to shave my head. Aging is doubly gruesome for women, even with this epoch that strains men to mirror Adonis, and where the new sexy requires not just intelligence, but emotional intelligence too. For women, there are the minutiae of beauty standards, then the optional preferred trauma of childbirth. My youngest sister's pregnancies reveal that cruel dichotomy: two smart, unruly boys, and with them the concomitant destruction of her prized ballerina's body. In her kitchen of Lego bricks and kid-soft bananas, I assume her question kindred. Bro, how's your receding hairline? But then she grins and her eyes narrow. This is some years after India, and while I've acclimatized to shorter haircuts, they've brought with them a vast and alarming, expanding desert vista that is my forehead. Sunset behind me as she and I chat, I'm fully aware I don a dazzling candy apple halo that glints in my head's crown and warms the egg smoothness I've scrutinized front on many times over. So I just recount that from a piece of personal writing to say that at the beginning I'm talking about beauty standards, and I don't really give any detailed examples. I mean, I mention my sister, but I don't go into the details of how this has affected her body in particular ways. I just say it's there's been an element of quote unquote destruction of her ballerina body, and that's how she sees it, which is why I use that word. And then when I actually talk about the my own experiences of her and I talking, we're in the kitchen and there's more detail. The sun is behind me. I give details of colour and my own thoughts and the stresses that I'm going through emotionally in talking about this and thinking about this. So this is to say that when you actually think about time, it can actually be because you are thinking about the length of time you want to spend on a particular component of a story in order to bring a certain richness and bring the audience into that part of the story. So you actually, go into some detail, and it's not just a narration, but maybe there's dialogue and more detailed description. Just to give you another example, in interview, and that's one of the assignments, that's the third assignment coming up, where you actually do an interview, you control time in certain ways, in particular ways. And one of the ways to do that is to ask a question that generates a binary answer, so a closed question. You can ask someone to, describe a particular experience, and they will do that at some length, perhaps. And then if you just want to move on, you might say, so, is it that you're saying this is what happened and that is how you felt about it? That's a yes no generating question, and therefore you can use that to actually control the pacing of a particular dialogue. So we can talk about chronemics and its uses in that way as well. So this is our final slide of nonverbal comms, and it contains two more categories of nonverbal communication that I think are important. One is kinesics, which is to do with the physical movement, and the other is this rather silly term, I think, but nonetheless it's there, which is gesturemics, which deals with gesturing. And I suppose the term has come about because there's a particular focus on the ways in which we move our hands, for example. So talking about kinesics, how do you move physically? Do you stand behind a lectern? Do you move around? Obviously, it depends on the kind of presentation you're giving. No one really expects someone giving a, Bible reading or a eulogy to be moving around, to be pacing around. And obviously, there may be reasons that you do not move around a lot, and that can shape the way you communicate and the way someone receives your communication. If you're presenting to a business audience, for example, you might want to include some kind of theatrics, like stepping around the room. It can be useful. It can be a way of generating some attention to you, and that's sometimes what happens in different kinds of presentations. When I was court reporting, at one point I went to some courts in a part of England, legal courts, and there was this barrister in his wig and gown who paraded around the courtroom, and he strutted and made his arguments. And I have to say, for me, it appeared less about his content and more about him being showy. He might argue that in being theatrical, the judge and jurors and the court reporters paid him more attention, and that's in an effective way for him to have been communicating. And perhaps he wasn't wrong, because I certainly recall that situation. I myself have varying degrees of comfort when it comes to moving around, and I do sometimes and don't, but you don't want to find yourself moving around and getting lost in your own world, pacing or moving incessantly. I don't think that will be a good thing, and it's quite tiresome it's quite tiresome, but it's quite tiring to watch, rather. It can actually be quite distracting, because remember, as a presenter, you're there to convey your message, and the audience are present for mutual benefit. You want to be heard, but you also want to be taken seriously. You don't want to lose your audience. So if you move around too much and you get lost, it could be seen by the audience as a certain kind of disrespect. You haven't put in the effort to practice what you're doing, to perfect what you're doing. If you falter, that's different. But if you haven't given it your maximal effort, then I think that can be quite, can leave people feeling quite despondent. Equally, standing still at a stationary point can create a great deal of focus and intensity. Obviously, I've seen speeches, presentations in which someone has been stationary in one spot, or they've been in a wheelchair, for example, and given very compelling presentations. And the fact that they're stationary, whether it be about the wheelchair or not, or the use of the wheelchair or not, it actually creates a great moment to focus on that individual, and it can be really interesting to watch and really engaging. So now on to this idea of gesture remix. I've included 3 pictures here of the British Prime Minister currently, Boris Johnson, and he actually uses gesture, like a lot of politicians, in order to add emphasis to what he's doing. He sometimes has a closed fist. He has his palms down for adding emphasis when he's making a point. And I'm actually going to include a clip below that I want you to take a look at. Watch what he does, and you'll notice, of course, that he appears to be reading from a teleprompter, which means it's written, and it comes off as written. But in this actual clip of him, he uses his hands to add emphasis, but to me it feels very rehearsed, and this is something that obviously politicians are taught. And there is an exercise that we're going to do in tutorial in which we look at body language, and we just get some more detail out of this kind of concept of how these things can impact the way you present. So take a look at the Boris Johnson clip and see what you think. For me, I'll tell you now, and then you can watch it after. I think that it's quite striking, that it's contrived. The coaching is clear, and as you'll hear from what we do in tutorial, it can be quite rude, read as rude culturally if you point at someone. And so for emphasis, politicians use the kind of closed fist, and hands down or hands up, because it does something. And I want you to watch the video and see what you think. And remember the video, because in tutorial we're going to be looking at another one, and it's also very important. So here's where I'm going to sign off and say thank you. That's all the material for today. No doubt in an emoji somewhere on the screen your mood might be represented. I look forward to expanding on the material about audience analysis and body language in tutorial. Many thanks.